In June 1942, Adolf Hitler held a meeting with Ferdinand Porsche to discuss the future of German armor. Hitler demanded a tank that was invulnerable. He wanted a moving fortress that no Allied shell could penetrate. He didn't care about speed. He didn't care about fuel consumption. He cared about size and dominance. The result of this meeting was the Panzer VIII, better known as the Maus. It remains the heaviest fully enclosed armored fighting vehicle ever built in human history. But to a logistician or a bridge engineer, the Maus wasn't a weapon. It was a crime against physics. This is the engineering audit of a 188-ton monster that was too heavy to fight. It is the story of how the Nazi obsession with superweapons actually accelerated their defeat. To understand the absurdity of the Maus, we have to look at the numbers. A standard US Sherman tank weighed about 30 tons. The German Tiger I weighed 54 tons. The Maus weighed 188 tons. That is the equivalent of a Boeing 747 jumbo jet, but compressed into a steel box the size of a garage. The armor on the front hull was 200 millimeters thick. The turret front was 220 millimeters thick. It carried a massive 128 millimeter naval gun, capable of destroying any Allied tank from 3 kilometers away. On paper, it looked like the ultimate weapon. In reality, it was a logistical nightmare from the moment it was drawn. The first problem was the engine. How do you move 188 tons of steel? Ferdinand Porsche, who was a brilliant but often impractical engineer, proposed a radical solution. He designed a petrol-electric hybrid drive system similar to a diesel locomotive. A massive aircraft engine would power an electric generator. This generator would send electricity to 2 massive electric motors connected to the tracks. This system eliminated the need for a traditional transmission, which would have shattered under the torque. But the sheer weight of the electrical components added tons to the vehicle. The first prototype, the V1, didn't even have a turret. It used a concrete block to simulate the weight. When they tested it at the Kummersdorf proving grounds, it immediately sank into the mud. This brings us to the most critical failure of the Maus: ground pressure. Tanks work because their tracks distribute their weight over a large area, allowing them to float over soft ground. But the Maus was so heavy that even with tracks that were 3.6 feet wide, it acted like a pile driver. It didn't drive over the ground, it destroyed the ground. During tests, the vibrations from the Maus were so severe that they shattered windows in nearby buildings. If the tank turned too sharply, the sheer friction would rip the tracks apart or tear up the road surface. But the biggest enemy of the Maus wasn't the mud, it was the bridges. There was not a single bridge in Eastern Europe capable of supporting 188 tons. If a Maus tried to cross a standard stone or steel bridge, the structure would collapse instantly. This presented a tactical paradox. How do you cross a river if you can't use a bridge? The German engineers came up with a solution that was technically ingenious, but tactically insane. They decided that the Maus would drive under the river. They designed a Snorkel system. The tank would be sealed waterproof. A massive air pipe would be raised from the turret to the surface. Because the electric motors didn't need air, only the generator engine did, the tank could operate underwater. However, there was a catch. The generator engine had to be turned off to prevent it from sucking in water. So, the Maus crossing the river had to be powered by an electrical cable connected to another Maus sitting on the bank. One Maus would act as the power station, feeding electricity to the second Maus crawling along the riverbed. Imagine the logistics of this in the middle of a battle. You have to stop, seal the tank, deploy a Snorkel, connect a high-voltage cable to another tank, and drive blindly into a river. It would take hours. And while this was happening, the tank was a sitting duck for Allied aircraft. If the cable snapped or the Snorkel leaked, the crew would drown in a steel coffin at the bottom of the river. Then there was the issue of fuel. As we discussed in our oil crisis video, Germany was starving for fuel by 1944. The Maus was the least fuel-efficient vehicle ever created for land warfare. On roads, it consumed roughly 1 gallon of fuel for every 30 yards traveled. Off-road, the consumption was even worse. To move a battalion of these tanks just 100 kilometers would have required a dedicated fuel train. The internal fuel tanks held nearly 1,000 gallons, but that was only enough for a short tactical hop. In a nation where pilots were grounded due to a lack of gas, building a tank that guzzled fuel was strategic suicide. Despite these flaws, Hitler was enamored with the project. He saw it as the iron fist that would smash the Red Army. He ordered a production run of 150 vehicles, but the realities of the war intervened. The Allies were bombing the factories. The factory producing the hull components was hit by the RAF. The factory producing the engine was hit by the USAAF. By late 1944, only 2 prototypes had been completed, the V1 with the dummy turret and the V2 with the real turret. The program was officially cancelled in November 1944, but the prototypes remained at Kummersdorf. As the Soviet army approached Berlin in April 1945, the Germans faced a dilemma. They had these 2 invincible monsters, but they couldn't move them. They couldn't retreat because the bridges wouldn't hold them. They couldn't fight because they had no fuel and likely no ammunition. So the German engineers were ordered to destroy their own masterpiece. They placed charges inside the V2 prototype and detonated them. The explosion was massive. It blew the 55-ton turret off the hull and left the vehicle a burning wreck. The V1 prototype was also abandoned nearby. When the Soviet troops arrived, they found the wreckage. They were stunned by the size of the armor plating. They had never seen anything like it. The Soviets captured the remains. They took the turret from the destroyed V2 and mounted it on the hull of the V1. They shipped this Frankenstein tank back to Kubinka in Russia for testing. When the Soviet engineers tested it, they confirmed what the German engineers already knew. The tank was useless. It was a bunker, not a vehicle. The transmission broke constantly. The suspension failed under the weight. It was a target practice dummy for artillery, too slow to run and too big to hide. The mouse represents the ultimate failure of the wonder weapon, Wunderwaffe, mentality. The Germans believed that superior engineering could overcome numerical inferiority. They thought one 188-ton tank was worth 20 30-ton tanks. But war is about mobility and logistics. 20 Sherman tanks can surround a mouse. They can blow off its tracks. They can call in an airstrike. A P-47 Thunderbolt pilot, looking down at a mouse, wouldn't see a threat. He would see a target he couldn't miss. The resources poured into the mouse program were staggering. The high-grade steel used for the armor could have been used to build hundreds of Hetzer tank destroyers. The copper used in the electric drives could have been used for radar or radios, which, as we know, they lacked. The engineering hours spent solving the underwater driving problem could have been spent improving the Panther's transmission. It was an ego project, driven by a dictator who equated size with power. There is a fascinating parallel with the Landkreuzer P.1000 Ratte. This was a proposed tank even bigger than the Maus, 1,000 tons. It would have been the size of a battleship, armed with naval guns. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, finally cancelled it, realizing it was pure insanity. But the Maus actually got built. It physically existed. It is the limit of what is possible with steel and tracks. If you make a tank any heavier, it simply sinks into the earth. The Maus sits today in the Kubinka Tank Museum near Moscow. It is a hollow shell. The interior was gutted for analysis decades ago, but standing next to it, you feel a sense of awe and dread. It is a monument to the terrifying capabilities of German industry, but also to its blindness. It is a dinosaur that evolved to be too big for its environment. The Allies won the war with the Sherman and the T-34, tanks that were good enough and could cross a bridge. The Germans lost with the Tiger and the Maus, tanks that were perfect but stuck in the mud. The legacy of the Maus is a lesson in requirements creep. When you let a non-engineer, Hitler, dictate specifications, you get a monster. He kept adding armor, he kept adding bigger guns, and with every addition, the tank became less of a vehicle and more of a statue. Tactically, the Maus was intended to be a breakthrough tank. It was supposed to punch a hole in the enemy line that lighter tanks could stream through. But by 1944, Germany was on the defensive. They didn't need breakthrough tanks, they needed mobile defense. A tank that moves at 8 miles per hour cannot react to a blitzkrieg. The Maus is also a testament to the skill of the workers who built it. Despite the chaos of the bombing and the shortages, The welding and machining on the hull were flawless. It was a beautifully made piece of useless junk. It perfectly encapsulates the tragedy of the German war effort. Tactical brilliance wasted on strategic stupidity. They solved every engineering problem except the one that mattered. Is this actually useful? They figured out how to drive a tank underwater, but they didn't figure out why they would want to. In the end, the Maus never fired a shot in anger. Its only kill was the German economy.